second, thank you, to what is our second in our Center for Refugee Studies colloquium series. And we are delighted to be welcoming Heba here to come and speak with us. And before I introduce Heba Gowayed, I would just like to do our land acknowledgement. I know that Sean did one last week or at the last CRS seminar, but especially given the timing of this one, I think it's important to remind us that while you are all in many different locations, and I hope that you will also reflect on the land acknowledgement in your own current region, but York University is situated on land that have had a longstanding relationship with many Indigenous nations. And York University wants to acknowledge that it is currently on traditional territory of a number of those nations. This area was known as Tkaronto, and it has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, and we would like to acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And I think it's always really important for us when we're talking about forced migration to recognize that we are on land that was also associated with the forced displacement of many peoples. It is my great pleasure to welcome Heba Gowayed, who will be our speaker today. She's an assistant professor of sociology at Boston University, and we had the pleasure of doing some work with her many years ago on a shared project. Her research is global and comparative and examines how low-income people traverse social services, immigration laws, and their associated bureaucracies while grappling with gender and racial inequalities. She's the author of Refuge, a book which has been published with Princeton University Press, which explores how states shape the potential of people pursuing refuge within their borders. And she's currently working on her second book, The Cost of Borders, which theorizes borders as a costly and often deadly transaction. It is my pleasure to welcome Heba Gowayed here today. She has given us permission to record her talk, but if you are concerned about being recorded, you can turn off your cameras so that you are not visible. And thank you, Heba. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michaela, for this generous introduction. It feels, like things are coming full circle because, Michaela was so generous in welcoming me, at York back in, when I was a graduate student. I actually could not continue to work with her because of, on this wonderful project, because I was giving job talks, and now, the book is out and I'm back, in this new position. So this is really wonderful to be here. And today I'm sharing with you the findings of the book that Michaela mentioned that I published in April of 2022. And the book is a comparative ethnography of the experiences of Syrians in the United States, Canada, and Germany. And as you all know, can everybody see my slides okay? Yeah, okay, yes. Great. Yeah. As you all know, the world is facing, one of the largest displacement crises in modern history. And this is due to long-standing realities of local violence produced by colonial legacies and newer facts of environmental degradation and the disappearance of land and resources. 82.4 million people, more than 1% of the world's population, are currently forcibly displaced from their homes. And among them, 25 million people, which the number is steadily rising, are displaced outside of their country of origin. And the largest population of displaced people remains Syrians, 6.7 million of the total displaced outside of their country of origin. And in a sense, we're beginning to understand the ramifications of what this global migration crisis looks like and how it's worsening. So in this presentation, I'm sharing with you the findings of a comparative ethnography that followed Syrians as they began new lives in the United States, Canada, and Germany, countries that offered them resettlement and asylum, which the United Nations identifies as durable solutions to the problem of displacement. And in this project, despite the fact that refugees of all nations have very, different backgrounds, I focus on the experiences of refugees who were skilled or semi-skilled, but not highly credentialed, and who arrived in each of these countries between 2015 and 2016. And I'm going to argue throughout this presentation that human capital, typically examined as a crucial determinant of immigrant outcomes, is itself structured through state incorporation policies. Further, I show that this process of production is both gendered and racialized. But before I expand on this argument, let me first give you a background of how these men and women became refugees, which is also an explanation of their selection into each of the 3 countries in this study. So the Syrians in this study who lived in cities like Homs, Syria's 3rd largest, where this covered market once stood. They became refugees due to a war that began in 2011 as a result of the government's violent response to civil protests for social change, the Syrian manifestation of what came to be known colloquially as the Arab Spring. The war took with it the sights and sounds of their neighborhoods, where their families had lived, and the homes that they had built, as well as, unfortunately, the lives of their loved ones. At first, people fled their homes to nearby areas, but eventually, as the war got worse, many fled the country. And most initially crossed into countries of immediate refuge, countries like Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon, which continued to host, I think it's over 88% of all Syrians who are displaced. There, they registered with the United Nations Higher Council for Refugees. And what ended up happening is that this influx created tensions with local residents, resulting in some cases the targeting and exploitation of Syrians who did not have legal status in these countries of immediate refuge. Lebanon, for instance, a country with a population of just 6 million, hosted 1 million Syrian refugees. So you can imagine how that can become a politicized issue. And for those who wanted to leave these countries of immediate refuge, they had 2 possible solutions. One is resettlement and the other is asylum. And resettlement is where refugees are selected for travel to a 3rd country. They're selected on the basis of a vulnerability assessment, which is a measure of the family's financial burdens, number of school-aged children, health conditions of family members, or violence and exploitation in the aforementioned countries of immediate refuge. Importantly, when offered resettlement in a given country, people can say yes or no, but they cannot choose the destination itself. Refugees are then vetted for travel through an arduous process that can take up to 2 years. And the United States and Canada led the world on resettlement, right, which is a program that takes hundreds of thousands of people each year on its best years. However, given the sheer number of displaced people globally, and given the limited slots, that are available, resettlement is a rare solution. And only 1% of refugees are ever offered resettlement. So for those who are not offered resettlement, the other solution to displacement is asylum. And I'm sure many of you remember watching in the summer of 2015 as almost 1 million people, with the help of smugglers, made the treacherous journey into blow-up rafts across the Mediterranean Sea and into Europe. But these journeys were incredibly dangerous. As one woman, Wale, put it to me rhetorically, do you know what it is to go into debt to put your children in the arms of death? Asylum is where a refugee stakes his or her claims, showing up in a country that could offer them legal status, and applying for that status. By some estimates, Germany took in about 500,000 Syrians between 2015 and 2016. But the thing is that resettlement and asylum offer those seeking refuge an opportunity to rebuild their lives in well-equipped, wealthy countries with full legal status. But what do these 2 institutional solutions actually mean for people who have experienced such traumatic displacement and who are embarking on new beginnings in strange countries? Today, we're going to look at resettlement and asylum, not as ends to journeys as they're often cast, but instead as continuations to the process of seeking refuge. Indeed, by the time that the Syrians in the study had arrived to each of the United States, Canada, and Germany, they'd experienced a number of significant and jarring losses. They'd lost their country, arriving to a new one where the adat wa taqalid, or norms and traditions, were entirely different, whose language was not their mother tongue, and where there would be ethnic, religious, and racial minorities stigmatized by association to terrorism. They had resigned themselves to not seeing family for the foreseeable future. But what's more, they would experience a dimming of their potential. In countries of resettlement and asylum, their skills and abilities, what we commonly refer to as their human capital, did not have the same resonance as they did in Syria. And the focus of this presentation is on why. The term human capital, central to studies in economics, as you know, refers to the individual abilities and qualities that make workers productive. Sociologists have shown that human capital is an important determinant of immigrant socioeconomic mobility alongside characteristics of the receiving context, particularly for first-generation immigrants. In other words, the literature shows that human capital and context together shape immigrant outcomes. Human capital is typically measured cross-sectionally as years of education or occupational histories. It's imagined as something that immigrants bring with them, an independent variable, if you will, that shapes other outcomes. However, this leaves the question unresolved. If one had, say, 5 years of Syrian public school education or held an occupation as an artisan in Syria, how does this actually matter for their productivity in a destination economy? Some have tried to explain the discrepancies that we see in how immigrants translate their skills and abilities. Human capital theorists explain it by suggesting that immigrants must actually just lack the necessary skills, right? They're not getting returns because they don't have the same skills as people in the destination country. Signaling theorists argue that this explanation doesn't make sense because skills are not a tangible object. Instead, they hold that immigrant skills and credentials must be illegible to employers because they are foreign to them, regardless of the actual skills that immigrants hold. Yet other theorists show that the reading of credentials is shaped by racism, or that the skills of minoritized groups are necessarily seen as inferior. However, all of these explanations continue to treat the immigrant as a puzzle piece entering a labor market puzzle. But what of the state which governs the entire process of migration? So in this study, I introduce a theory of state-structured human capital. I argue, looking at this early period and through a comparative lens, that human capital can be created, transformed, or destroyed through the incorporation policies of receiving countries, which derive from national approaches to social welfare. I find that incorporation systems can intervene in two ways. First, they can recognize or ignore immigrant histories, seeing people as unskilled who may in fact have skills that could be activated. And this has always mattered for highly skilled immigrants. You know, we've written about this in terms of doctors or in terms of lawyers. But also, I'm going to talk to you today about Amin, who arrives in Germany after working his whole life as a truck driver. And I showed that this history of working as a truck driver only matters in the German context so long as it's recognized as being relevant to becoming a truck driver in Germany. Second, states can invest in newcomers' skills so that refugees can translate their histories in ways that are productive in a new setting, or enable them to acquire new skills that matter in that setting. For instance, people can be provided with language learning classes or new skills building that is needed in the receiving economy, but that they did not previously have. States can also provide financial assistance to allow newcomers to benefit from existing skill building opportunities. So for these reasons, I argue that human capital is not only a determinant of immigrant outcomes, but also an outcome in and of itself structured by state incorporation policies. I also show that the production of human capital is gendered. As scholars of gender have shown, institutions and services themselves feature gendered explanations of who is a worker. These interact with Syrian refugee gender expectations, where men are often primary breadwinners, resulting in different, and as I will show, sometimes surprising outcomes for women and men. And I show that the production of human capital is also racialized. Countries equip new arrivals in their pursuit of a good, stable life through the same racist social welfare systems that have long shaped the contours of national belonging. But what's more, as scholars of race have long shown, discrimination and racist violence diminishes possibilities. And here we see it both in the denial of opportunities to minoritized people and through their own fear of being in public space. I'm going to show that this was particularly bad for hijabi women whose identity is more conspicuous in Western contexts. Now, turning to theory on immigrant reception, Foundational literature in sociology holds that immigrant welcome is contingent on determinants, including race, social capital, or legal status. The focus in this literature tends to be on long-term integration, or how immigrants fit into notions of a national whole. Instead, I join others who have shifted the question, focusing not on how immigrants fit into context, but how context works in the lives of immigrants. I focus on the understudied and crucial initial years in which newcomer histories collide with new systems to coalesce into first designations of race, of legal status, and of course of human capital. This early period is crucial as it shapes immigrants' starting positions in new countries. I focus specifically on social welfare policies, which have long shaped the contours of national belonging and from which social assistance offered to immigrants derives. Finally, I compare refugees who, because they receive social assistance denied other categories of immigrants due to their legal recognition as refugees, are a conservative case to explore how incorporation policies matter for new arrivals. But before refugees are incorporated through resettlement policies, the men and women in this study must be admitted with refugee status. So in the US and Canada, as you all know, recognized refugees are admitted per long-time resettlement systems. On your screen is the approximate number of Syrians taken in by each country between 2015 and 2017. Germany, as you can see, took in at least 500,000 refugees, and this was due to a temporary suspension of the Dublin regulation by Angela Merkel, which would have otherwise stopped refugees at the European borders, preventing them from making it inland, as was the case for forever prior to her suspension. Legally, in the United States and Canada, refugees have permanent residency within a year of arrival. In Canada, actually, it's immediate. But in Germany, they receive a 1 or 3 year renewable residency depending on their level of protection. There was a lot of political play with the level of protection offered refugees, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. Okay, so what are these countries' incorporation policies for refugees? Each derives from a different kind of state welfare system. So I argue that in the United States, what we have is a liberal market economy that limits the role of the state. As one feature, the United States has a limited social service system because it treats poverty as an individual failure, as argued, for instance, by Michael Katz in The Undeserving Poor. In her work, Sibel Fox shows that this approach to poverty is inextricably linked to the disenfranchisement of Black Americans in the United States. Refugees' only regular cash assistance comes through TANF, the national welfare system offered to low-income people throughout the country. And introduced in 1996, the program has lifetime limits and offers very low amounts of cash. The design matches the goal of both TANF and the 1980 Refugee Act, which is for self-sufficiency, that the low-income refugees included should not be reliant on government assistance. So what about Canada? Canada is also a liberal market economy, but characterized by what's been called inclusive liberalism. So as you all know, since I'm speaking to an audience based in Canada, the social service system in Canada deriving from this outlook is much more generous than the one in the United States, providing Canadians who need it, who need the help with enough assistance to cover basic needs, as argued, for instance, by Dan Zuberi in his book. The generosity shapes the Canadian government's proactive approach to immigrant incorporation, which is facilitated by other more restrictive aspects of Canada's immigration policy. So, the Canadian case is going to come out as the best case of the three in this presentation. However, that is not without very, very strong caveats about, what integration means in this context, particularly in relation to, the discouragement of migration through other channels. But again, I'm sure we can have a conversation in the Q&A about that. Okay, so as Irene Blomrad shows, immigrants and refugees are received through state-sponsored multiculturalism. And Canada actively seeks to integrate immigrants into the fabric of its society by providing both instrumental and symbolic assistance, including the recognition and support of ethnic groups. So it's with this expressed goal of integration that refugees are met. Finally, Germany is a corporatist system where the national economy is organized by coordination between the state, unions, and employers to the benefit of all three. The system includes high levels of expenditure on social programming and a highly centralized and powerful state that Meyer Marx-Free describes as producing the nation. This nation was long comprised of ethnic Germans, as Germany has a long history of excluding non-Germanic people from full integration. Syrians entering this system benefit from generous financial assistance from the German state, the most generous of all three of the countries, actually. However, it comes with meaningful conditions. The first is to learn German, then to enter the labor market, which is a condition of permanent residency. People need to gain German credentials, as do 85% of German workers. As a result, I call the resettlement program in Germany and the asylum program in Germany one of credentialization. Okay, so how did refugees experience these systems? Before I get to the data, let me give you a brief explanation of my methods and case selection. So to compile the neat data collection chart on the screen involved an ethnography conducted in 3 countries over the span of 3 years. I'm a fluent Arabic speaker, and in 2015, I was kicked out of my field site in Egypt, the long-term consequences of another dictatorial backlash against the Arab Spring. I was living in Connecticut when the United States government began to resettle Syrians there to a local resettlement agency in 2015. I volunteered initially as an interpreter, where I met the 18 families in my project who I got to know closely over the coming years, observing firsthand meetings they had with the Department of Social Services, negotiations with off-the-books employers, and interactions with the resettlement agency. I recognized how important U.S. social services were to their story. Though they were living in a liberal city with strong social services compared to elsewhere in the United States, they had tremendous trepidation about their assistance and about finding jobs. They were living under the constant threat of the quicksand of American poverty. I wondered how refugee experiences in other countries were different. Just then, Trudeau, who had run on a platform of resettling 25,000 refugees to Canada, won the premiership and was making good on his promise. Flights to Canada at the time were inexpensive, and I got to Toronto in February in time to see thousands of people crammed into hotels and motels and government offices, trying to rent cars to go apartment searching in the brutally cold Canadian winter. There I include 5 families, 2 of whom are related to families in New Haven, and all of whom were selected based on the same selection process of those in the United States, making them good comparative cases. While Canada has a private sponsorship program, as you all know, I only include people selected by a government sponsorship for the sake of comparability, though 2 of the families did also receive private sponsor support for 6 months as part of a hybrid program, which I'm happy to talk about more also in the Q&A. I visited Canada for a month initially, returning every 6 months for 2 weeks, and maintained contact with families in the interim using WhatsApp and social media. I also, with Michaela's help, observed focus group discussions that happen with both privately sponsored and government-sponsored refugees, which helped me sort of triangulate and make sense of my findings. Finally, with the help of NSF and the Horowitz Foundation, I included the case of Germany due to the sheer number of refugees admitted, and because it is a welfare state with a very different integration approach. So in the summer of 2017, I included 5 families who are related to families elsewhere in my study. But because this research would not be longitudinal, as was in Canada or the United States, I returned to the summer of 2018 to conduct an additional 15 interviews. And this allowed me to sort of have a bigger sample, and this was from the sample developed by the University of Constance's National Survey on Refugees, which was just being launched. And these interviews were in Bavaria. So regarding the study sample in the United States, Canada, and Germany, as you will see in this presentation, I compared people who come from similar backgrounds. The men were carpenters, truck drivers, chefs, house painters, working skilled or semi-skilled occupations, but without strong education or formal credentials. The women, for the most part, were not employed in Syria, with a few meaningful exceptions. However, in the German interviews, I do also have some cases of people who were more highly skilled, which again, I'm happy to talk about that variation in the Q&A. Okay, so now let us talk about what people reveal, what their experiences reveal about the incorporation policies in the United States, Canada, and Germany. This slide, okay. So to organize findings in each of the cases, I describe how refugees experience their arrival and the assistance they receive from the state. I then explore how each system structured the human capital of the newly arrived refugees and how that experience was different for women and men. And I begin with the case of the United States and how men and women adjusted to the self-sufficiency imperative of the resettlement policy. Here I highlight the case of Roger and Majid, who just 7 years prior were a middle-class couple living in Homs, Syria, around the corner from the covered market that I showed you earlier. In 2010, they had finally achieved their dream of building their own home, leaving the foundations in place to build additional floors for each of their 3 children, the oldest of whom was a preteen at the time. Their enjoyment of this dream was short-lived. In 2011, they fled to Jordan, where Majid, who had owned his own restaurant in Syria, became an undocumented worker at a shawarma stand. The couple, along with their 3 children, arrived in JFK, John F. Kennedy Airport in New York, in October of 2015. An international organization for migration van drove them from JFK to New Haven, Connecticut. They were dropped off in a dimly lit parking lot of an off-track betting facility at the edge of town. They piled into the car of the resettlement agency caseworker and made their way to a low-income neighborhood of the post-industrial city. Their apartment was on the 2nd floor of what used to be a single-family home, and they would soon realize it had a mouse infestation. There, the couple would be visited by a caseworker who would tell them what their assistance would be. During this meeting, they learned about TANF, the American welfare system, for the first time. They would receive $803 per month, the benefit for a family of 5. They would also receive a comparable amount of food stamps through an electronic benefit transfer, or EBT, that could only go towards food items. At this meeting, they also learned that their rent was $1,000 a month. Here's a budget sheet of another family early in their resettlement. So because people don't read English, on the left is clip art of each of the expenses. Each column header is the month, which this family translated into their Arabic names. Yellow highlighter is the welcome money, federal funding, which is $975 per refugee. In green is what the family is expected to pay. As you can see, for the first 3 to 6 months, the resettlement agency would help the family pay their rent using a mix of federal funding and welcome money, as well as donations to the agency. The family would be expected to pay half the TANF rent, while half of their TANF towards rent, while the agency would cover the rest. But when this assistance was up, TANF alone was insufficient to cover the rent, right? I said 805 versus 1,000. There was no discussion in the family as to who would find a job. As the household's breadwinner, Mejid felt that this was his responsibility. And this brings us to the issue of state-structured human capital tied to labor market entry. Mejid lacked an effective social network. His friends were refugees who were just as poor as he was. However, through a contact at the mosque, he was referred to an Egyptian pizza store owner. He helped in the kitchen. Mejid earned minimum wage at this job. Due to the nature of the job, however, he had no control over his shifts. Though he tried to attend English classes, his work schedule was unpredictable. He also did not have the energy or time to study after his shift. Low-income work in the United States is characterized by precarity, with unpredictable schedules, a lack of a living wage, and de-skilling. In Syria, the men were carpenters, electricians, contractors, and chefs. When they met with each other in the United States, they introduced themselves listing these mehan, or occupations, as part of their identities. In the United States, however, most worked low-wage jobs, dishwashers, janitors, gas station attendants, where coworkers did not speak English, that's how they got the job, and where they did not have the energy or time to attend English classes after work. As one man put it, I want to work, but I'm new here. We just got here. We don't understand anything, but you want to push me to fishuni to work. So we work whatever, hayallah. Most work in restaurants doing whatever. Everyone is working against their will. No one is happy. In other countries, they allow us to study, to get assistance. They say you're not allowed to work so you can learn. Not here. Meanwhile, after the kids enrolled in school, Rajet and the other women began to attend English classes in the morning. By staying out of the labor market, the women had the opportunity to build new human capital. The English they were learning enabled the women to do a series of tasks that their husbands could not. They could communicate with service providers and resettlement agency staff. They could advocate for their children in school, and they were building for the citizenship exam that they would take in 5 years' time. In addition, most of the women within a year after their resettlement took on some kind of income earning tasks to support their husbands. The women utilized the skills that they had. For example, Rajet crocheted baby clothes and flower pins, and 26-year-old Reda, whose husband's offer had said with finality, our wives don't work, did work. She prepared sweets, halawat al-laban, and kunafa that her husband sold to other co-ethnics. In this way, the women reimagined their existing human capital for new labor market returns. However, as I learned when I began the citizenship class with a group earlier this year, even for the women, the gains were short-lived. None of these activities, because they were not earned with a pay stub, were recognized by the Department of Social Services as qualified work. The women could not receive limited federal child care subsidies to pursue them. And as families settled in, babies were born. Sarah joked, Donald Trump is trying to keep Syrians out of the country, but look at us, we're making more Syrians here. With nowhere to leave their children, the women dropped out of English class. Also, it is important to note that the women were hindered in their pursuit of the language as a result of anti-Muslim racism. On your screen is a hateful message sent to the mosque in 2016. As hate crimes against Muslims spiked, including incidents against people in this study, they shied away from being outdoors on their own. Reda, for instance, stopped going to English classes altogether after her family was attacked, and Rajet also stopped going for a period of time. 5 years after their arrival, none of the men and few of the women had enough English to qualify for the citizenship exam, a crucial barrier to inclusion and protection against policies like the travel ban that reduce their feelings of security in the United States. So in sum, the self-sufficiency imperative interacted with men and women's division of labor to result in men entering the labor market within months of their arrival, which reduced their ability to rebuild their human capital. Meanwhile, women, staying out of the labor market because their husbands entered in their stead, were able to begin to learn more English and reimagine their skills in new ways. But 5 years after their arrival, they too did not have much by way of language capital. My findings link to national data, which shows that though refugees enter the labor market quickly and are employed at higher rates than non-immigrants, they have lower incomes than the native born and other immigrants, gaps that are increasing for new cohorts. Importantly, 20 years in, however, over half continue to have low English proficiency. The experience of refugee resettlement in the United States, then, is an integration into American poverty, which by design is populated by people of color and marked by stagnation. So now that I've given you the case of the United States, let me turn to the case of Canada. A drive 500 miles north of New Haven takes us to Toronto, where Denya, a relative of one of the families in New Haven, lived with her husband and 4 children. Denya has a laugh that can be heard ringing down the hallway of her apartment building. Her husband, Bassam, is a good deal older than her, and like Majid, he owned his own restaurant and homes. The couple has 3 children, including a son that requires a hearing aid, who was placed in a school for the deaf in Canada, something that Denya was really ecstatic about. When Bassam and Denya arrived, Costi, an organization that was managing resettlement on behalf of the Canadian government, housed them in a hotel. They would be allowed to choose their own residence. They chose to move to Mississauga, an area with a large Arab community, where a market around the corner that sells the latest in Islamic fashion transplants the customer to an old town souk. 2 other families in my study chose to move to Kitchener and Hamilton with a group of other families, starting a Syrian community out of the arrivals in Toronto, people they did not previously know. The Canadian government gave the families a startup allowance of $5,000 to cover first and last month's rent. The government also provided new arrivals with standard issue new furniture for their home. For families resettled through private sponsors, the expectation was that the sponsors would match this assistance. The family received cash assistance of $1,600 a month, $800 per parent, in addition to the Canadian child benefit of approximately $450 per school-age child, which was at the time, the allocation for low-income families. At first, after the first year, the families who still needed assistance would receive welfare, which was a few $100s less, but still supported the needs of families. The Canadian government, as is clear on their website, anticipated the transition from refugee assistance to welfare, saying, when income support from government or private sponsors ends after 12 months, in most cases, it is a normal occurrence for some refugees to transition to provincial or territorial social assistance support. Denya and Bassam's rent for a 3-bedroom apartment in a high-rise in Mississauga was $1,400 a month, which they would cover and exceed with this assistance. So the families did not need to follow the timeline of families in the United States. They could wait to enter the labor market. In fact, they were incentivized to do so by the cash assistance, which they would lose if they became employed. And this differently structured their human capital as it allowed them to learn English and gain skills. Unlike in the United States, where men had to enter the labor market early and women were the only ones who could learn English, in Canada, the opportunity was theoretically available to both men and women. Each morning, Bassam and Denya attended English classes a short walk from their home. After a year of lessons, their English remained halting, but enabled them to have telephone conversations, something that neither the men nor women could accomplish in the United States. And while there was variation in the sample as to who attended English classes regularly, particularly when you account for mental health issues and unequal access to childcare support, there were opportunities for education. Courses through which people could gain skills or earn diplomas, which were free and readily available. However, the system in Canada is uneven in recognizing skills. So while a blacksmith in the study could find work immediately as a blacksmith, a woman who was a nurse in Syria and who had confronted the war as a nurse could not gain equivalency, particularly as she lost her paperwork fleeing the war. She was told she'd need at least 5 years of schooling to become a nurse in Canada. An electrician in the study was hired in an apprenticeship based on his existing credentials, but told he would need to pass an exam to become a fully licensed electrician in the country. All three, however, as well as others in the study, benefited from publicly available and free education. The blacksmith took courses on becoming a forklift operator, trying to figure out another option given that he had a bad back. The engineer was considering earning a certificate in electrical engineering since he would need to go back to school anyway because he needed education for the exam, so he figured he might get an additional credential. And the nurse took classes in community counseling, though she wasn't sure she could make a full career out of it. This existence of classes benefited others too. Denya said in her usual jovial manner, Denya that cooks and cleans is over, khalas. She was enrolling in a class to do hair. And Yasmin, who was Almar the blacksmith's wife, took classes in food prep and began to work at a restaurant. It is important to note that in Canada too, hate crimes were high against Muslims, almost as high as in the US. However, the families in my study felt in a sense insulated from this hate. Ethnography is not a good measure of incidence, but this feeling of security says something because it wasn't the case in my ethnographic observations in the United States or Germany. One explanation is that Syrians in Canada, unlike in the US or Germany, had free mobility on where they could go to an extent, and many chose to live among co-ethnics, which facilitated their economic opportunities as well. This is how, for instance, Bassem and Yasmin found work in Arab restaurants. What's more, in this specific case of the sample that I chose, people could live in or near cosmopolitan Toronto since they were resettled there. However, I also think that what cannot be discounted is Canada's active promotion of a policy of multiculturalism and inclusivity by law, which, as Irene Bloemrad describes, means that the state is focused on investing in people through the aforementioned language courses and educational opportunities, but also through radio programming in their language and support for co-ethnic groups through NGOs, for instance, that cater to specific ethnicities. And this does, in her work, show that it generates a higher sense of belonging as compared at least to the United States. So in sum, through the investment, the Canadian government supported refugee expression of human capital and gaining of new human capital through language learning, though recognition was inconsistent. We don't see as strong of a divergence by gender as we do in the United States. A Syrian outcomes report in Canada found that among government-sponsored refugees who arrived in 2015, 43% had found stable employment by 2018. So even though this number is lower than it would be in the United States, this has a clear human capital trade-off. The same Canadian study shows that 7 in 10 of these same refugees attended English classes regularly. And over 80% reported feeling that they could go shopping or to the doctor's office or interact in social situations in English. Studies show that 15 years after their arrival, refugee income and labor market participation looks similar to that of other immigrants and Canadians, and English tends to be fluent. In sum, the Canadian system, by creating opportunities for the expression of existing human capital and creation of new human capital, leaves those seeking refuge feeling a stronger sense of financial security and belonging than their counterparts in the United States. Okay, so finally, what about Germany? Arrival in the German case of asylum is more dangerous, of course, than in the case of resettlement. Iman, along with her husband Emin and their 3 children, arrived in Germany in the summer of 2015. Emin was a long-haul truck driver in Damascus, where he was imprisoned due to tipping off the resistance on a delivery of ammunition. After he was resettled, by the intervention of his boss, the family fled the country. They first fled to Turkey and then a year later got on a raft to Greece. After an 18-day trek through Europe, including 3 days of detainment in Hungary, which Iman describes as the worst days in her life, including the war, they arrived in Germany $400 in debt to someone they had met along the way. They could not afford to travel further to their intended Sweden. After a welcoming arrival in Germany, that brought Iman to tears. They spent 2 days in a police camp and then a month in a refugee camp in Leipzig, at which point they secured their 3-year temporary residency. Now, this was a very, very fast turnaround. Typically, the process takes closer to a year. Iman and Amin received assistance from the German government through the job center, where unemployment assistance is distributed in Germany. Their rent in Dusseldorf was covered by the job center, and they received a monthly amount that covered their basic expenditures and allowed them to send 50 euros home every once in a while. Like in Canada, refugees' language learning is the issue of first concern for the German government. However, unlike in Ontario, Syrian refugees are required to attend German classes under penalty of a reduction of their assistance. Emin and Iman enrolled in class. In order to secure work in Germany, refugees would have to accomplish at least a B1 level of German. This meant succeeding in 4 courses, 3 A levels and the first is a B level, which could take a minimum of a year, but more realistically 2, particularly for people who weren't literate in Arabic. The classes also taught basics about German culture and laws. But then, if Amin wanted to become a truck driver in Germany, he would need to do training through an apprenticeship system called an Ausbildung for an additional 3 years. His experience as a truck driver, the fact that he had gotten arrested and tortured in prison as a result of this occupation, was irrelevant. It wasn't seen by the German state as qualifying Amin to work. In order to find work in Germany, he would have to abide by the same rules as Germans. This made the Syrian refugees feel inadequate. As Odey, a 31-year-old former mechanic, said, "The Germans see themselves here," putting his hand up flat to his forehead. "If you want to be with us, then you have to catch up with us. When you get here, it's like you're a newborn." Another respondent was more explicit, calling the system racist and explaining, "There's no recognition that I'm coming from Syria with an 11th grade education and that I want to continue to finish my education. Why can't I just continue on? It's racist. We left war and came here to be met by this racist system." For some, the lack of recognition of their professional history as human capital that matters for the German labor market resulted in giving up on securing equivalency. In Bavaria, BMW hired through temp agencies that did not require them to give workers permanent contracts. The temp agencies took a cut of 50 cents for each hour the men worked. These jobs provided little security and left the Syrians uncredentialized vis-a-vis the German system. But for all, a main driver to enter the German economy was a fear that the German government would not renew their residencies unless the Syrians proved to be productive. Angela Merkel was trusted, but they worried about who would come after her, which, we're going to see now. For women, by contrast, the credentialization requirement cleared a pathway to the labor market. Yara, who had married her husband, a Palestinian refugee in Syria, when she was 15 years old, said that she would not have continued her education or worked in Syria. "I dropped out of school young," she told me. "I wasn't a particularly good student and I got married young. In Syria, I would have taken care of my house and our kids. In Germany, however, she said that she wanted to become a dental assistant. 3 years after arriving in Germany, she was finishing up her B1 and in the process of applying for her Ausbildung. Similarly, Marwa, who arrived with her husband and 1 child and who was pregnant with the second, knew that she would enter the labor market. Of course, here you need 2 incomes, she explained, shrugging when I asked her if her and her husband had spoken about it. It was an obvious thing. However, here too, it's important to highlight the role of racism in shaping the experiences of new arrivals. The image on your screen is of hateful messages one woman received in her mailbox from a neighbor. Not only did new arrivals see the policies of the German state as exclusionary, or as one respondent put it, a German system that works well for the Germans, but also they felt that they were expected to relinquish parts of their identities to better fit notions of German Leitkultur, or leading culture. In Germany, where Turkish people are a substantial immigrant minority, estimated to be 5% of the German population, the Syrians are racialized as Muslim in relation to this group that's perceived to not want to assimilate. Particularly meaningful for the expression of human capital, women are turned away from jobs because they wore the hijab. For instance, a 22-year-old woman was told by the German government employee at the job center that she could not work at a daycare while wearing her hijab because, quote, it would send the wrong message to the children. So in Germany, the system of credentialization ignored labor market histories and lengthened pathways to the labor market. Here we see a strong divergence by gender, in that people with labor market histories, often men, were disadvantaged by the non-recognition, and people without labor market histories, often women and young people, were advantaged by investment in credentialization, however, with important caveats given women's unique experiences of racism. 3 years into their asylum, 72% of Syrians remained unemployed, despite the need for them in German labor market, where their unemployment at the time ranged around 4%. The erasure of skills and abilities through non-recognition is detrimental to asylees who have more to offer and who experience financial, political, and emotional injury by not being able to offer it. But it also injures the German state, of course, which was looking for their contributions. So this case emphasizes that in addition to the investment states make through incorporation policies, recognition is key and crucial to expressing existing human capital. In short, the presence of a German system for Germans leaves newcomers feeling marginalized economically and otherwise. So now that I've presented my data, I conclude by returning to my main argument. This global ethnography centers the experiences of men and women who come from similar socioeconomic backgrounds in their initial years in 3 countries of permanent refuge. It advances the theory of state-structured human capital by showing that human capital, often conceptualized as a determinant of refugee outcomes, is a product of national incorporation policy, and specifically whether countries are willing to invest in and recognize refugee potential. In Germany, a diminished ability to use human capital is an outcome of a lack of recognition of immigrant histories as human capital. In the United States, a diminished ability to use pre-existing skills in the labor market is an outcome of a lack of investment in newly arrived refugees so that they can use their skills and capacities productively in the United States economy. In Canada, investment and recognition result in an ability to use and create new human capital. These processes, as I've shown, are racialized and gendered because the social welfare systems in each of these countries feature these inequalities, and refugees arrive to them as racialized minorities with their own expectations for men and women's labor. And let me leave you with 3 key implications. First, in accounts of refugee crises and in international laws, refugees are cast as victims, and receiving states that offer these durable solutions are often cast as saviors. Implicit to this is the racist idea that life in the West is necessarily a privilege, and therefore countries are accomplishing their humanitarian commitment simply by admitting refugees. But admission into American poverty is no one's salvation. Indeed, wealthy countries that receive refugees, including the US, Canada, and Germany, are complicit in the colonial legacies, foreign military interventions, and environmental degradations that are creating the very conditions from which refugees are fleeing. And within their borders, they too are capable of violence. The violence of minoritizing, of denying living wages, of the non-recognition of people's humanity. This project captures how countries equip new arrivals for their pursuit of a good, stable life through the very same systems that have long shaped the contours of national belonging. Second and following, observing how the human capital of those seeking refuge is structured reveals the ways in which it matters well beyond the labor market. Language acquisition is necessary for everything from making friends to securing citizenship in all 3 countries. And the ability to express human potential is emotionally important. How would any of us feel if all we had accomplished and built professionally became meaningless to those around us? Finally, the study has implications well beyond the case of refugees or even immigrants. Through a design that follows the simultaneous experiences of people seeking refuge who are strangers to systems of social welfare, we raise a mirror to these systems themselves and how they shape inequality more broadly. The national incorporation systems that structure the human capital of refugees are the same systems which low-income people traversed across these 3 countries for decades, well before this cohort of Syrians arrived. Thank you all for your time.